The ruins found in modern Egypt are certainly very impressive, but how much do we really know about them for sure? The aim of this particular episode will be to show you that whatever little can be found about what we call ancient Egyptians' ruins from the various historic sources is actually unknown to most people. They have never even heard about it. While at the same time, most of the things that we have been told are kind of indisputable facts about the history of these ruins. Most of that is either a far-fetched speculation or even deliberate lie, kind of a red herring meant to put in a wrong riverbed all future attempts to find out who and why built all this. And the truth will be very shocking for those of you who listen very carefully till the end, because we see an entire passages of the Bible, not something similar, but like real Bible passages written with hieroglyphs on the walls of these allegedly ancient Egyptian temples. And although that is well known and not disputed even by mainstream scientists, still the children in school continue to learn that these are 3,000 years old buildings. Although it usually makes sense to always start with the beginning of the history of a given culture or civilization, in the case of Egypt, we'll start with the end, with the hope that it will make the realization of how little actually we know about Egypt less painful. Because we all tend to hang to our belief system even when it's wrong, we tend to resist change, because by honestly admitting that we've been wrong about something, in most cases, that reveals that we've been wrong about many other things, and that can be quite difficult to face. And so we start with the end of the glorious so-called ancient Egyptian rulers was not in some faraway forgotten time, thousands of years ago, but just a couple of 100 years ago, when the Mamelukes, the last genuine initiated keepers of this knowledge, were mercilessly slaughtered. No, they were not bloodthirsty demons, as they are telling us nowadays. This is what we are told by their murderers. And Napoleon, whom we have been told that went to give light to Egypt, his mission was actually to destroy physically as much as he could from the still standing ancient heritage. But we are told a different story today, that he went there with a team of scientists to study the ruins, by lining up his soldiers to shoot the face of the Sphinx.
This is a 500-year-old map, or a copy of it, kept in a museum in Nuremberg. The map depicts Constantinople, or nowadays Istanbul. We see quite an international crowd of ships, so to say, in those ancient cities. Of course, we see a ship with a Muslim flag. Then there's a ship of a two-headed eagle, which has always been and is still nowadays on the symbols of many European countries. And the third one is a sphinx, a flag with a sphinx on it. Well, sphinxes have always been a symbol of Egypt, but why is there a Christian flag as well next to the sphinx? Let's take a look into this.
When modern historians talk about the Mamelukes, these are the type of images they show us, while the contemporary artists depicted the Mamelukes in this way. So, as it is clearly visible from the mummified bodies found in the historic Egyptian burials and from the depictions on the walls of the temples, The people who built them were a really international crowd. Clearly, there were dark Africans, there were tanned people, there were blonde Caucasian people, everything was there. And it is very important to understand that the Mamelukes were actually descendants, if not in a blood sense, then surely in the sense of culture, descendants of the Caucasian blonde people that we see depicted on the temples, which we called ancient Egyptian temples, but how ancient were they should be really questioned because of the Bible inscriptions on them. But even if they are, even if we assume that they are really a couple of thousand years old, still it is very interesting, and even more interesting to see the evidence that I'm gonna show you about the connections between this culture, which I call the culture of the survivors, or maybe of the Hyperboreans, which also could mean Atlantis, because it is only a guess for now that the Hyperboreans lived in the area of the North Pole. The mainstream historians are telling us that the Mamluks were slaves gathered from various countries in Asia. But this is just a modern fantasy. The sources of that time tell a completely different story.
Mainstream historians are telling us that the Mamluks were slaves gathered from various countries in Asia. But this is just modern fantasy. The sources of their time tell of a completely different story. The Egyptian historian Amin al-Khali wrote an interesting book sometime in the middle of the last century, which consisted of materials that he collected from medieval Arabic historical chronicles. The name of the book is Relations Between the Inhabitants of Nile and Balgan, between 12th to 14th century.
And exactly this place, the region around the river Volga in nowadays Russia, that, according to the Book of Veles, is the place where initially the Slavic people landed. Was it from Hyperborea, from Atlantis, from space? We don't know, but they landed there first. And from over there, they spread all over the world. And interestingly enough, the most recent DNA samples taken from Paracas, Peru, mummies of red-haired and often elongated skull mummies, they also show connection with the DNA of the people exactly of this region around the river Volga. So in his book, Al-Min al-Holi, the Egyptian historian, quotes an Egyptian sultan, historic sultan, who says,
"We and the Tartars are of one plan and will never renounce each other." Further, we read that the ramifications issued by the Egyptian sultans were fully valid within the areas of the Volga, and so the merchants who traveled back and forth were free from paying the duties that were imposed on outside traders. In other words, the Mamelukes were treated as if it was all clans in the outside areas of the river Volga. For example, the Sultan of Masur, Kalamur, although lived in Egypt many years, he never found the need to learn Arabic language. His predecessor also needed a translator when he spoke Arabic.
Hajib Ahmaz Beshtaq al-Kipchaki is one of the most famous emirs, and he did not find it suitable to use Arabic in his palace, and for that reason he also kept translators when he needed to communicate with the Arab-speaking people of Egypt at that time. These are only some of the more interesting examples and material supporting evidence and quotes which I found in the works of Anatoly Fomenko and his new chronology project. Over there in his works, which are available, many of them even for free on internet, you can find much more supporting evidence. I don't agree, though, with all the interpretations of the new chronology team of this obvious evidence of connection between the European and Asian cultures and Egypt. Connection doesn't necessarily mean that the people who originally came from the Volga region created this entire civilization, which built the magnificent temples and megaliths at the delta of River Nile. There are other possible scenarios. For example, Egypt could have been a center of civilization and learning and knowledge even before the Hyperboreans got connected to it. We don't know actually. We should not assume things. So let's hear a few more quotes about the Mamelukes.
Martin Baumgarten was a cavalier and a nobleman of the German Empire. He visited Egypt and wrote down his first-hand witnessed accounts of the Mamelukes at the time before their official history was fabricated. This is what he says. The Mamelukes are Christian. They baptize their children when they are born. And then he goes on giving details about the exact ritual of baptism, and later on says, and so most of the Mamelukes come from various Christian nations like Germans, Albanians, Serbs, Italians, and Spanish.
Now let's see how Martin Baumgarten describes
Ali Bey, the factual ruler of the Mamelukes that he met himself, and tells us about how he looked like. Ali Bey was around 45. His face was long and reddish. He was blond. His eyes were big and very clear. His beard was somewhat reddish and pointed. His eyebrows were dense. He was wearing Turkish outfits, and then he goes on describing his various turbans for various occasions. And this is not the only account of this sort. 18th century chronicle, written again by a person who saw the Mamelukes with his own eyes, and that is Abd ar-Rahman al-Jabati. He described Osman Aga, who at that time was the so-called Turkish ruler of Egypt, as being blonde. This photograph is taken in year 1905, and these are the daughters of the Egyptian Khedive Abbas Halimi Pasha, who was remotely related to the Mamelukes who were wiped out some 100 years earlier.
It illustrates what was the result of mixing Mamelukes with Arabic people. But what about modern descendants of the Mamelukes? Maybe they will tell us the real history. Or it will be interesting also how would they look like. Well, there aren't any. All the Mamelukes were slaughtered by those same colonial forces which slaughtered the samurais of Japan, the red-haired people of Peru, and all other communities which kept some of the old knowledge and old history. It's very convenient. When you kill them all, then you can make up any story you wish about them, and there will be nobody to object.
According to the official history, Egypt was freed from the oppressive Mamelukes by the Western European military forces. And let's see when the Christian Western Europeans freed their Christian brothers, the Copts, in Egypt, what did they do with them? Normally, one would expect, if that situation was true, that they would rejoice meeting other similarly minded people who glorified their Lord Jesus Christ. The truth is, they didn't care about any Jesus Christ. The monasteries lay in ruins, churches were plundered, the leaders of the clergy, no record of them. The Coptic Christianity was still pure. It still had the original message of Jesus Christ about how to modify the reality we live in with the power of our thoughts and intentions. The soldiers of the parasites quarantined the Coptic Christianity for some 50 years, waiting for one generation to die and forget the truth, and after that they kindly allow it to revive itself and resurrect again, but with changed ideology. They removed the original message of Christ and substituted it with parasitic so-called Christianity,
which emphasizes that humans are slaves, powerless slaves. They cannot do anything but wait for some unknown mercy. Nobody knows if it will come and how, but you should wait because you cannot do anything else. You are powerless. So just wait, although you're not sure what you're waiting for, but you wait, and while you wait, you the powerless slave, don't forget to be obedient, otherwise God will be angry, of course, and don't forget to pay your taxes, of course. And all these philosophies are far away from the original teachings of Christ, who taught powerful techniques of learning how to use the magical powers which we all have. The ideology of the early Copts, those before the Copt Reformation by the foreigners, their ideology was so near to the Egyptian ideology, or at least as much as we can find out about it from the translated hieroglyphic texts, that even mainstream sources don't deny that the Copts are direct continuation of that line of thinking. But how could that be possible if the so-called ancient Egyptian culture, which had that ideology, thrived thousands of years ago, and the Copts relatively recently?
As I explained earlier, one of the prime instruments in fabrication of the fraudulent history was to drive important events in culture way back in the past to make them look unimportant and irrelevant to us. The kingdoms of the Egyptian pharaohs were also artificially shifted to the faraway past, but in reality the last pharaohs were Christian themselves. Christ appeared in the already rotting from within society of the survivors to restore the truth. That is why the original pure Christianity was popular amongst the various cultures all around the globe, of whom the survivors were bedrock. And there is no wonder that we see Christianity amongst the last pharaoh kingdoms of Egypt. Mainstream historians are persistently trying to hide the very obvious and clear connection between the Copts and the pharaohs, and the ambiguous phrases like, for example, they say the magical and medicinal literature of the Copts is a direct continuation of the ancient Egyptian one.
Now listen to a short passage quote from these ancient Egyptian so-called magical texts. They don't even call them directly Christian because it will look silly, but here it is.
Hor for El Eloi, Adonai, Yahweh Savov, Michael, Jesus, help us and our homes. Amen.
This type of obviously Christian prayers they call magical spells of the pharaohs, and as usual, conveniently forget to tell us the exact quotes, but will speak hours about its meaning. And all this is done to bamboozle us, to make us not notice the obvious connection between Christianity and the last pharaohs.
This is one of the items in the burial of Tutankhamun. Is there any need of commentary? Well, this is a Christian cross.
This could have been the dagger of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun. It is decorated with European animals. But of course, we are not sure if it was really his, because this full story with the alleged discovery of his tomb is fake. But still, some of the artifacts are genuine, not sure which ones exactly. And probably they were taken from another tomb in the vicinity of the actually forged tomb of Tutankhamun. Again, the team of Anatoly Fomenko studied this tomb of Tutankhamun. They went there a few times, and I think they have the best resources on this matter, because many have discussed the possible forgery of this alleged tomb discovery.
Everybody knows that many of the ancient Egyptian paintings, or maybe at this point we should stop calling them ancient, but since they are famous as being ancient, excuse me if sometimes I still say that by mistake. So those are full of crosses, and if somebody still doubts that those crosses by chance look like Christian crosses, here on this one you can see the Christian cross in its this is not exact the time when supposedly some ancient Egyptian temples were subsequently converted into churches, as the mainstream historians cunningly try to convince us. Here is another Christian cross that they have forgotten to hide, and it's still visible amongst the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic signs. And this is another one laying there in the corner in one of the ancient Egyptian temples. Two ancient Egyptian statues with Christian crosses on their back. And these are Coptic images. The crosses are very, very similar to the Egyptian crosses. Here are a few more Egyptian Ankh crosses. And so, sometime in the end of the 18th century, some Jesuits are being sent to Egypt to start fabricating the future image of ancient Egypt as we know it nowadays, and which is absolute historical fiction. Remember earlier it was exactly Jesuits who took a very active part in fabricating the books that would serve as the basis of the fictional history during the Reformation period. Egyptology as science started existing very, very late in the 19th century. At that time, the Scaliger version of history was already widely accepted as scientific, and the Egyptologists were forced to adjust everything to fit those mistaken axioms that were laying the basis of the timeline of Scaliger. And if they would disagree with the Scaliger timeline, they wouldn't be employed as official scientists anymore, very much like today actually. Sometimes so-called ancient sources are quoted to support the Scaliger Pitavius timeline of Egyptian history. However, please be aware that, for example, the most famous of them, the work of Manethon, is not available in original nowadays. And so if you see some quote from Maniphone, well, it is very easy to manufacture all of that, to fabricate it, because the original is no longer available. So you can put any fantasy and label it as coming from Maniphone, no problem. And so is the situation with all other so-called ancient sources. As far as the official history of the various dynasties and times of rule, of reign of various pharaohs, that was easily fabricated by Henry Bruch, who approached the matter in a very practical way. He took various lists from the temple carvings. Some of them definitely were names of pharaohs. Others was not sure, but he took some lists that he liked, and also assuming, according to his liking, that those were only pharaohs. Others, they didn't fit so well, so declared them mythical, mythology, and did not include them. And then to fix easily the dates of their reign, he just decided that everybody has ruled 33 years, or to be more exact, 100 years for every 3 pharaohs. And that is how this full history was cooked and was ready to be served to the public as science. Egypt was one of the most important centers of the culture of the survivors. Over there, the knowledge of the magical abilities of the humans was kept alive until few hundred years ago by Copts and Mamelukes, and that is why it was very important for the soldiers of the parasites to distort the Egyptian history in such a monstrous way. And so people are confused. There is one thing in the history books, but the actual artifacts point towards completely different story, and they don't know what to think. Did aliens build all this? Because according to history we could not have built them. We were barely coming out from the monkeys.
The myth that it was Champollion who deciphered the hieroglyphs is very popular.
But if you delve even a little bit in history, you will easily find out that people were reading the hieroglyphs even before that. The problem with reading them the traditional way was that full passages with the Bible content were shining from the walls of the Egyptian temples, and that was not allowed because those temples were artificially sent thousands of years back in history. There was a dictionary, so to say, guide how to read the hieroglyphs by Horapollo, and that was natural to exist because when in Egypt they shifted from hieroglyphs to other writings, there was the need of a dictionary, and Horapollo compiled it, and it worked fine. If it was mistaken, then the result would be some sort of unintelligible text. But the result, people and researchers were using his dictionary to read the inscriptions on the temples, and the result was okay, it was very sensible, but it was declared false because it did not fit the fabricated history of Scaliger and Petavius.
And they used a cheap trick to do it. First of all, they publicly declared that Horapollo was wrong. He's just wrong. That was done, of course, using the usual magical mantra the scientists said, because modern people will believe anything if this mantra is put in front of the statement.
After that, it was publicly and very loudly announced that Champollion, hurrah, hurrah, has finally deciphered the hieroglyphs. And after the society was informed about that and believed it, then, without much publicity within the scientific society only, it was confessed that, oh, but Horapollo was right after all about so many things. And what are these so many things?
Well, practically everything besides the most essential points, the most essential things which they wanted to hide from people, like, for example, details of how the ancient Egyptians manipulated energy, so that we can't learn that as well. Also, they changed the meaning of some words, which clearly showed again and again that the last pharaohs were Christians. But that worked only partially, because even in modern news, even very recently again, oh, a new discovery, and yet another Bible text word to word inscribed on the ancient Egyptian temple wall.
The modern history textbooks with great authority assure us that Napoleon visited Egypt to give it light. Napoleon gave light to Egypt. It freed it from oppression. Let's see what kind of light was that. Was it not the same light that was brought to the samurais by the so-called merchant ships? Contemporaries wrote about Napoleon's visit in this way. Napoleon did a lot in Egypt, really a lot. But a lot of what? And was it really about giving light, or things that should not have been done by real gentlemen? Even mainstream chronicles mention that he lined up his soldiers against the Sphinx and ordered them to shoot in its face. Along with Napoleon, with his army, were traveling many scientists, writers, and painters. Let's see what were they exactly doing in Egypt. In the second half of 16th century, Pierre Bellon reports that the outer casing of the Great Pyramid is completely intact and looks newish. Jean Chenot is the secretary of the French embassy in Egypt, and in 1548 he records that most of the outer casing of the Great Pyramid is still intact. A very interesting medieval first-hand witness gives us valuable information. The physician from Baghdad, Abd al-Latif, writes, "The outer lining of the Great Pyramid is all covered with very ancient writing. Nobody understands anymore this writing. The inscriptions are so abundant that if somebody wanted to copy them, that would be more than 10,000 pages." A Masudi traveler from the Masudi tribe also shares his account that the Great Pyramid is all covered with various inscriptions in alphabets belonging to various nations that have disappeared a long time ago. Three other medieval travelers confirm basically the same thing, and those are Ibn Hawqal, Abu Mashat Jafar, and Wilhelm de Boldenzele. So the question arises, how come the locals in the area of Cairo started needing building material exactly when the West Europeans attacked Egypt? Were the locals not building houses before that? Were they building them out of water? No, they always needed building material. However, before Egypt was mercilessly attacked by the Western Europeans, the guardians of the pyramids and of the Egyptian culture were still living, still besides them, guarding them. Napoleon did not come to give light to Egypt. He came to destroy its culture. And that is why the lining of the magnificent Great Pyramid was turned into building material. Maybe the locals were even invited and encouraged to take it away because the inscriptions on it were uncomfortable for the Scaliger Petavius timeline. Napoleon also took priceless pieces of art to Europe, where they lay till nowadays, most of them in the vaults, because they are not suitable for public display. These are modern video games for kids. Since small, the children of the human race are brainwashed to become cruel parasites destroying the culture that celebrates peace, beauty, and harmony. They are trained since childhood to accept the parasitic, ugly, violent, cruel existence as something natural. These particular video games replicate exactly this historic period of the time when Napoleon raped Egypt.
The modern kids are encouraged to take a virtual part in this shameful event, and when they grow up, they will be already trained in going to foreign lands to destroy peaceful cultures.
So what about Champollion? In the archive of the Italian city Turin, in year 1824 was written down the following. Champollion was very careful, especially when it comes to rewriting the names and dates connected with the rulers of Egypt. Rewriting. This was recorded by the Italian Posiner. Now this is interesting. Peter Ellerbach writes about the visit of the architect Fritz Max Hessemer in 1829 in Egypt. Here it goes. I was very unlucky that I ended up in Egypt right after Champollion. What did that guy do over there? The tomb of Fever was one of the best. It was preserved in its pristine state. There were no damages. But after Champollion, the most beautiful items in it are simply broken down and they lay around into pieces. Those who have seen it before and after cannot recognize it. In the first half of the 19th century, a book was published under the name Wanderings of a Russian Sailor in Egypt, Syria, and Greece. He was a great admirer, and he was always crying at the thought that he will finally see the miracles that he has heard about. He had the descriptions of Champollion, but when he went on the actual spots, the things were not there, and he asked the locals what happened. He asked the local Arab where are the things that Champollion writes about, and much to his surprise, the Arab answered that it was Champollion himself who destroyed the inscriptions. The Arab at that time still himself remembers Champollion doing it. The seller was perplexed and asked why would he do that, and the Arab answered Champollion wanted to be the only one who knows what was actually written there. Those of you who have visited Egypt are well aware that, or even only from photos on the internet, one can easily see that many of the sites are in very poor condition and they're really destroyed on purpose with hammers and chisels. With great authority, the modern historians assure us that it was the Egyptians themselves who did all that, to supposedly erase the memory of pharaohs who they stopped liking. Of course, that is fabricated only nowadays. There are no authentic records suggesting anything like this. And even if we just think with our own head a little bit, we'll find out that such scenario is quite fishy. Why? The Egyptians obviously took great care of decorating the world around them. They liked beautiful things, it's obvious from the items and buildings that they left behind. Obviously, they were not people that were devoid of artistic taste. And now, in case such people really wanted to get rid of the memories of a particular pharaoh, do you really believe that they will break down their beautiful buildings in the middle of their main squares with in a most barbarian way with hammers? Wouldn't they just chisel out the name of the pharaoh and substitute it with something else? Most likely, this savage destruction of the beautiful Egyptian buildings started when the Europeans came to bring light to Egypt.